Thanks very much, Frank, and to George Washington University for giving me this opportunity. It reminds me, thank you very much, it reminds me of a committee room in the European Parliament with all of the sort of pros and cons that experience gives me. And I'll make that point because I'll touch on it later in terms of where we're at in Europe in terms of dealing with some of these law enforcement issues, particularly within what is becoming increasingly complex political environment. So like many in the room, I've been a law enforcement professional for many years, about 25 years, mainly focusing on counter-terrorism and organized crime, 15 years focused exclusively on international police cooperation. For the last 5 years running the European Law Enforcement Agency, which I guess in US terms would be seen as a large fusion center, the leading law enforcement fusion center in Europe of around 800 officers from all the major agencies in Europe housed in our headquarters in The Hague, providing an intelligence service and an operational coordination center in around 18,000 cases a year. And as Frank says, I'm interested in running Interpol in the future. So very much my career profile is around international policing, and that's given me, of course, a particular insight into the problems of counterterrorism and organized crime. And my experience over those years, and I'm sure it would be felt by others in this room, is that the scale of the threat from organized crime and terrorism has pretty much ebbed and flowed. Of course, 9/11 had a particular impact. The key constant, I think, through that has been, though, progressive change in the nature of the threat. And on counter-terrorism, as we've seen, certainly in the last 10 years, a development of the Al-Qaeda franchise into a different, and some would say, I think, a more challenging form in terms of the ability of law enforcement security agencies to combat it. The development of the concept of the lone actor, the lone wolf, and now this rather more modern phenomenon of the foreign fighter as well. On organized crime, really a diversification of the threat, a move away from the traditional mafia model. We still have large mafia groups in Europe. The three largest Italian mafia groups are still making a lot of money, 135 billion euros at last count each year. That's their revenue, 7% of Italian GDP according to Italian government estimates. But they very much buck the trend, and now the trend moving away from that, away from the position we had 20 years ago where we had large Colombian cocaine cartels dominating the trade, into something that's much more diversified now, and a proliferation of smaller, more mobile, more agile, more entrepreneurial groups, at least 3,500 of them now internationally active in Europe alone, much more active in many more criminal sectors, penetrating many more economic sectors, and operating in ways that we haven't seen before. So progressive change, and I think the magnitude and the speed of that change in these security threats has accelerated, particularly in the last 5 years, in particular, I think, due to global forces. And we know that the forces of globalization in terms of technology, increased human mobility, growing interconnections in the world economy, all of these have brought tremendous benefits to society. But in our world, also we've seen great security threats arise from that, a change in the criminal landscape and certain dislocations in society as well. So online, as we know, it's the global reach of the online community, it's the rapidly evolving capability, and it's the particular security advantages that affords the criminal community. This principle of anonymity that we all enjoy online, combined with ever more sophisticated security protocols online, and in particular encryption capabilities, that make it increasingly difficult for police to trace the offender and to do anything about it. To such an extent, I think that we really are now in a very, very challenging space around the governance of the Internet, with the Internet, I think, becoming the primary enabler of organized crime activity in this day and age. On mobility, it's about the explosion of the transportation networks, which have found themselves into a proliferation in the transportation of illicit commodities around the world. In Europe, the phenomena in particular of low-cost airlines making it much easier to travel at short notice in a way that's afforded criminals particular ease of transport and to hide their activity. And of course in Europe, where we have 25 of our countries with border-free travel arrangements, and again those are easily exploited by the criminal community. We have a phenomenon as well of mobile organized crime groups. So these are groups that are carrying out rather traditional forms of crime, burglaries, hits on jewelry stores and so on, but doing it in multiple jurisdictions. So an organized crime group from Eastern Europe operating in 20 or more different countries in Europe, very often on simultaneous days, flying in, doing 12 hits in one day, flying out to the next country, supported by an on-the-spot criminal infrastructure of that ethnic criminal community in that country. And it's a particular phenomena that has suddenly come to life in a very significant form in the last 5 years, affecting every European country, and it's one of the top priorities that Europol is monitoring right now. And finally, the global force of the economy, the more integrated nature of the global economy creates certain advantages, I think, for criminal exploitation, e-commerce, of course, the deregulated nature of many of parts of the economy and markets as well. The financial crisis since 2008, in particular, finding their way into, I think, a significant increase in the black market economy. As people's disposable income have gone down, it's increased perhaps the black market economy, particularly in terms of health and safety products now that are moving online. So again, a strategic shift in the nature of the problem. No longer just Gucci handbags sold on street corners, but now fake cancer drugs, fake everything else sold online. And that's been a major new boost, I think, to the underground criminal economy. Now, in the context of that, a more globalized threat, the two major offsprings that I'll touch upon in the next 5 or so minutes are, as Frank says, foreign fighters and the threat from cyber. On foreign fighters, radicalized young men generally, radicalized on the internet normally, using the ease of transportation in Europe that I talked about to relatively easily actually find their way to Syria in particular, following a particular path which is normally flying into Turkey and then finding transportation overland into Syria. We see 20 nationalities plus of Europeans that have gone to Syria in recent months. The numbers globally are many, many thousands, of course. European nationals, our figures are around 1,200 plus, maybe as much as 2,000, maybe even more actually, of EU nationals that we think have traveled to Syria in the last 2 to 3 years. Many of these are, of course, second-generation immigrants. Many of them are coming from a relatively small number of countries, UK, Netherlands, Belgium, France as well. And of course the threat is obvious, as you all know. The threat is these radicalized individuals go there, they get trained in bomb-making capability. They are further radicalized by their experience in Syria, of course, and then they return home. And in some cases return home with intentions to carry out terrorist activity. We saw that in March 2012, Mohamed Merah in Toulouse killed 7 people in an act clearly, we think, linked to his radicalized experience, not in Syria in this case, but in the AfPak region, but nonetheless a clear example of what can happen in those cases. And I think, and it's not just Syria, of course, it's not just AfPak, it's a surprisingly high number of countries actually that have been part of the problem for the last 5 years and continue to be: Bosnia, Chechnya, Somalia, Yemen, and other areas as well. The response, of course, is around better intelligence monitoring of these people and of the wider community that provide a ready source of radicalized young individuals. Better intelligence monitoring, and in particular, better international cooperation, of course. At Europol, where, as I said, we have the architecture that allows us to bring together a concerted response in the European law enforcement community, then we're using our intelligence capabilities and our network that links over 450 agencies at the moment to provide that intelligence monitoring base and for better international cooperation. Series of operational meetings, the latest a couple of months ago, and we're just in the process this month of opening a new intelligence project in this area to monitor European travellers to and from Syria in particular. So we're already collecting and exchanging a lot of intel with our partners in this area, running it through our CT databases, as you might expect, and of course working with our US partners as well. So I'm in DC these 2 days, meeting most of the agencies, encouraging them to play a full part in this new work that we have in this area. I have to say, though, that it's pretty hard work to get this thing off the ground, not least because of the traditional sensitivities, conservative influences in the national security arena, which I understand, but nonetheless which sometimes inhibit the free flow, free exchange of intel in this area. So we're not getting the exchange of info at the level we would expect, and I think that's clearly going to harm our capability to provide an extensive coverage of this problem in the future. On cyber, this rapidly turning into the biggest challenge facing law enforcement. Others, including Director Comey, have said that recently. 2 essential problems, I've already touched on them really. One of attribution, how we can even find the offender online, and one of jurisdiction, of course, even if we do find them, what our access is to the jurisdiction concerned. Up to about 80% of our casework in Europe is targeted on Russian-speaking networks, and that gives you an idea for how difficult it might be in terms of going after these guys. And again, the response is similar, required. We need to, in particular, scale up our international collaborative efforts in this area. As part of that in the EU, we've responded by establishing a new hub, the European Cybercrime Centre, which was stood up last year as an operational part of Europol. And that's really trying to use the architecture of our organization to provide that increased international collaboration in Europe and beyond. So an intelligence hub, a platform to exchange information about the principal threats and the principal kingpins operating in this area, working in a much more substantial way than we have done in the past in Europe with industry. This month, for example, we are establishing a new European financial crime coalition with 21 major banks already signed up as a platform in industry to share with our platform in law enforcement where the principal threats are coming from, and similar platforms with other relevant parts of industry, for example, on cybersecurity. In the field of innovation, trying to develop work on the best practice already there in Europe and in the US, but in particular to develop our cyber investigative skills. And here, the police community in particular have quite a bit to do to catch up with those skills that the criminals already have. So we're working on developing new anti-malware capabilities, and we have some lab work in that area, and working with industry in particular, of course, to try and scale up our capabilities here. And the third area, perhaps the most important, is to use that intel capability, that innovation, to deliver, of course, operational impact. And in the first year of our center, coordinated 50 major operations, some of which, for example, included a week-long intensive operational coordinated effort in our headquarters, 70 agents from 16 different countries working on a huge case against child sex abuse online. And really that's the architecture that Europol can provide in Europe, bringing the whole community together to coordinate a very successful operation in this area. So foreign fighters and cyber therefore demonstrate the same thing, I think. What we're seeing at the moment is a below par level of international collaboration. Getting much better, but it's still not at the level which the threat clearly demands. Secondly, that the level of investigative skills required, particularly in the digital forensic space, are also lagging behind and are really challenging, I think, for the police environment in a way that we haven't seen for a generation. Until recently, and maybe even until now, the analysis of digital crime online has been seen as a specialist competence carried out by a particular area, a niche area of any national law enforcement agency. Is rapidly becoming a frontline task for every investigator of any serious crime or organized crime activity. Thirdly, the growing role of industry. And I think there have been, over many years, very good examples of public-private partnership, as we know, but actually not on a systematic basis in the way that we need in this area. And that's having to change, and there are some fantastic examples, many of them in the US actually, for how to work better with industry, and we're having to learn that lesson very quickly in Europe. Fourth area is around, a political one really, a public policy debate around the nexus between security and privacy, particularly online, but it also touches on the problem of monitoring, I think, foreign fighters or European citizens that are traveling to these conflict zones. And here the challenge is for legislators really. As the problem increasingly moves online and increasingly becomes more challenging and more global in nature, there is an increasingly legitimate need for national security agencies and the police to access that data online, of course, but at a time in which there is growing public distrust about government's intentions to monitor citizens' activity online. Of course, in the post-Snowden world, those concerns have been heightened, and certainly in Europe, where we're more used to data privacy being an issue that drives the debate, perhaps more so than security issues do. In the European Parliament, this has long been a hot topic, and it's translated itself into a series of legislative initiatives that are designed to increase privacy rights, increase privacy controls over government activity in this area, which sometimes makes it harder for police agencies to do their work. Now, I'm not criticizing those efforts, but it is, in the end, a political choice that has to be made about balancing the security and privacy needs. So in regards to foreign fighters especially, a law enforcement requirement, I think, to access data, for example, about passenger name rights, advanced passenger information for CT travel, data retention online as a need to fight cybercrime especially. And in the end, we're seeing, I think, a real difference between police capability in the real world and police capability online, and how to balance those interests in particular. So at the heart of this, of course, is about protecting citizens' rights. And we know that very traditional policing values include the principle of policing by public consent, and we must never lose that, of course. And I very much believe, therefore, that we have to maintain the highest possible levels of trust, of course, in police activity. That probably means we can afford to be more accountable, more open and transparent in the work that we do, even in the national security domain. And it certainly means that we have to manage private data in a very responsible way. We're used to doing in that. I think the particular regime that we work to at Europol, in light of the political climate that I'm talking about, is as robust and as high as I've experienced anywhere in the world. In the end, we've learned not just to cope with that and live with that, but we've learned to see that there's some benefits from that. In the sense that our databases are super clean. We're not allowed to have duplicate data. We're not allowed to hold incomplete data. We're not allowed, therefore, to hold junk data. And in the end, that helps the analysts. So there are actually also some positives here, and they shouldn't always be seen as a binary choice between data privacy and data security. So, right to privacy, very, very important value, and we have to respect that. But of course, the right to security is at least as important. And that's the debate that we're having in Europe right now about how to balance those two. So in conclusion, I would say that what we have is a new frontier for policing. I don't think it's a cliche to say that, particularly online and more broadly in light of this more globalized society about what we're seeing in the integrated economy and the increased mobility of people as well. The organized crime threat, I think, is getting to a scale where it has national security dimensions, certainly, but also in terms of the economic interests of any state. Some of the illicit profits that are being generated, particularly online right now, are of a magnitude that actually have a direct impact on the economic interests of a state, particularly at a time when so many countries are still trying to recover from the economic crisis. It's interesting, however, that at the political level that nexus is very, very rarely seen and made. There aren't many people that are advocating for an increased police activity, increased attack on organized crime in order to also help secure an economic recovery. Whereas I see a direct correlation between the two because of some of the scale of the activities that are involved. That law enforcement, of course, needs to scale up its activity, particularly in terms of its skills, in terms of its collaboration with industry, and certainly in terms of its international collaboration. Yes, on a bilateral level, which is many countries, including the US, still clearly rely on, but increasingly, because of the globalized nature of the problem, particularly online, you have to do this in a truly global way, international way as well. So we have to find a way of better integrating in a more systematic and thorough way the capabilities of international police bodies like Europol and Interpol. And my last point is about internet governance, and really a call to arms, I think, for legislators and political leaders in the US, in the EU, to make sure that we get the right balance in order to safely protect our citizens from these threats. Okay, that's it, Frank. Thank you.